Before pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, people are already reading the Australian sky, naming the land, crossing sea country, painting stone, grinding seeds, telling stories, and passing memory forward. The world around them does not look like the world on a modern map. The seas are lower, coastlines stretch farther outward. Islands that now sit apart from the mainland may once belong to larger chains of land, reef, sand, and mangrove. Across the north, monsoon rains move over stone escarpments and floodplains. Farther inland, dry country opens beneath immense skies. At night, the stars do not hang above the land like decoration. They are part of orientation, season, law, and memory. The dark gaps of the Milky Way, the movements of bright stars, the arrival of winds, the flowering of plants, the behavior of birds and fish, the shape of clouds over distant water. All of it belongs to a living intelligence that is not written in books, yet is precise enough to guide feet, canoes, fires, ceremonies, and generations. This is where the mystery begins, not with a lost city under sand or a ruined temple swallowed by vines, but with something stranger continuity that is still alive. The phrase "the world's oldest living culture" can be powerful, but it can also mislead if it is handled too simply. It does not mean one single culture has remained frozen, unchanged, for 50,000 years, like an artifact sealed behind glass. No living culture works that way. People move, adapt, trade, marry, argue, invent. Remember, forget, renew, and respond to land that itself is changing. What survives here is not a museum copy of the Ice Age. It is a vast network of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, many distinct peoples with their own country, sea country, languages, laws, kinship systems, ceremonies, stories, and histories. Their continuity is not stillness, it is relationship. It is the ability of knowledge to remain meaningful while the world around it shifts. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand the scale of this story, it helps to let ordinary historical time fall away. The pyramids of Egypt are only a few thousand years old. Stonehenge rises in the Neolithic. The first cities of Sumer belong to a world of farming, writing, kingship, and walls. Even the oldest known temples and monuments of Western Asia appear late when measured against the deep human presence in Australia. Archaeology at sites such as Madjedbebe in northern Australia suggest people are present on the continent by around 65,000 years ago, though scholars still debate the fine details of the earliest dates, the routes taken, and how quickly communities spread across the land. The evidence remains incomplete, as all evidence from such deep time must be. Wood rots, fibres vanish, shorelines drown, camps are buried, washed away, or remain undiscovered. Yet what does survive is enough to open an astonishing view. People are making tools, using ochre, processing plants, shaping stone, and building knowledge into place. The drama of this story is quieter than the collapse of an empire, but perhaps deeper. Empires announce themselves with palaces, roads, inscriptions, and armies. They leave behind broken columns and the names of kings. The earliest Australians leave something more difficult to follow and, in some ways, more intimate hearths. Stone flakes, grinding stones, pigments, shell middens, fish bones, tracks pressed into old sediment, paintings and engravings on rock, and above all a continuing cultural presence that insists the land is not empty scenery, It is country. That word carries more than geography. It holds belonging, obligation, ancestry, law, ecology, and care. It can include water, sky, plants, animals, reefs, winds, seasons, and places whose meaning is not separable from story. In a world trained to look for civilization in walls and monuments, this is a different kind of archive. It is not always vertical stone. Sometimes it is a song learned at the right time, a route followed across dry ground, a ceremony repeated because repetition itself is a form of preservation. There is a tendency in popular history to imagine deep time as silence. Before writing, people become shadows. Before cities, they become background figures moving through wilderness. But Australia pushes against that habit. Here, deep time is not silent. It has rock walls crowded with marks. It has oral traditions that may preserve memories of ancient sea level rise. It has landscapes where stories travel along paths, waterholes, headlands, and reefs. It has living communities whose cultural knowledge has carried across enormous disruption, including colonization, forced removal, language loss, and the ongoing struggle to protect sacred places. To speak of survival here is not to pretend nothing was broken. It is to recognize that continuity can be wounded and still continue. A language may be suppressed and later revived. A ceremony may be interrupted and then strengthened. A place may be threatened and still cared for. The first image, then, should not be a lonely Stone Age figure against a blank desert. It should be a continent alive with relationships. Imagine northern stone country at dawn, where heat begins to rise from red rock, and the calls of birds move through paper bark and pandanus. Smoke threads upward from a small fire. Ochre stains a hand. Someone knows which seeds need grinding, which water can be trusted, which wines bring change, which part of the coast is safe, which reef will expose itself at the right tide. Far away in time, ice sheets lock away water and lower the oceans. Australia is larger than it is now. The landmass of Sahul joins Australia with New Guinea and sometimes Tasmania. To know where to go, when to stay, how to raise children safely within community, how to remember where life comes from. No single explanation fully accounts for how such long cultural continuity endures. Archaeology can date a layer of sediment, identify a tool, examine pigment, analyze charcoal, and compare changing coastlines. Genetics can trace ancestry and population history. Linguistics can reveal patterns of diversity and contact, though the time depths are difficult. Oral tradition can hold knowledge in forms that do not behave like written chronology. None of these alone is enough. Together, they create a story more complex than a simple claim of 50,000 years. The better mystery is not whether one unchanged culture survived like a fossil. The better mystery is how many living cultures kept remaking themselves without severing their relationship to country. How memory could move through song, dance, storytelling, ceremony, and language. How law could be tied to places that changed shape. And how people could look at a sea that had swallowed an old plain and still know that country continued beneath the water. The ancient world has many vanished things. Civilizations rise and fall, languages disappear, species fade, rivers shift course, cities are abandoned until their names become guesses. But here the story refuses the usual ending. It is not a vanished world discovered only by outsiders with measuring tools. It is a deep past still connected to people living now. That does not make it simple. It makes it more demanding. It asks for care with words. Because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are not relics of prehistory, and their cultures are not merely evidence for someone else's theory of human origins. They are contemporary peoples with living rights and futures. Long before the first cities rise, people at the southern edge of the human world are already doing something extraordinary. They are making a home in deep time, and they're leaving traces that still breathe. The road into Sahul begins far beyond the red cliffs and floodplains of northern Australia. It begins in a wider human movement, a long expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and across Asia, not as a single march, not as one heroic migration, but as many generations of people moving through landscapes that were themselves changing. They follow rivers, coasts, forests, grasslands, islands, and seasonal routes. They move because animals move, because families connect, because climate opens one path and closes another, because curiosity and necessity often travel together. By the time people reach the threshold of Australia, they are already experienced survivors of varied worlds. They have crossed deserts and tropical forests, highlands and coastlines, places of monsoon rain and places of dry wind. What lies ahead is not just another valley or another shoreline. It is a different continent, separated by water even in the coldest parts of the Ice Age. And reaching it means that the first peoples of Sahul must solve one of the great problems in early human history: how to cross the sea into a world no modern human community has ever entered before. During the Ice Age, the map of this region is transformed. Sea levels are much lower than today because enormous volumes of water are locked away in glaciers far to the north and south. The shallow seas of Southeast Asia expose the vast shelf known as Sunda, joining much of what is now mainland Southeast Asia with islands such as Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. To the southeast lies Sahul, the ancient landmass that joins Australia, New Guinea, and, at times, Tasmania into one immense continental world. Between them is Wallacea, a broken zone of islands and deep channels. This middle world matters because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. Even when seas are lower, some channels remain open. There is no dry land bridge all the way from Asia to Australia. The people who reach Sahul must cross water. They may not see the whole continent ahead of them, but they can see signs, birds flying out beyond the horizon, clouds forming above distant land, floating vegetation, patterns of swell, and perhaps the faint outline of mountains or island ridges under certain conditions. What survives in the record suggests skill, planning, and social knowledge, though scholars still debate exactly how the crossings happened. The word migration can make this journey sound clean and directional, as if a line on a map explains it. But no one walks across deep time as a line. People live their way forward. Camps are made and left. Shellfish are gathered. Stone is struck into flakes. Fires are tended. Knowledge is tested, shared, corrected. A group does not need to know that it is entering a place that future maps will call Australia. It only needs to know that there is land ahead, that water can be crossed, that enough people can travel, and that the journey has meaning. Perhaps the first crossings are short hops between visible islands. Perhaps some are longer and more uncertain. Perhaps people move in pulses, stopping for generations in island worlds before another crossing becomes possible. No single explanation fully accounts for all the possibilities, because the earliest coastal camps that could have held crucial clues now often lie underwater, drowned by later sea level rise. The road into Sahul may have passed through shores that no archaeologist can easily reach. Still, the achievement is difficult to overstate. Long before the famous maritime cultures of later history, before written navigation, before ships leave inscriptions of kings and trade, people are moving through island Southeast Asia into Sahul. This does not require metal, sails, or maps in the modern sense. It requires something older and more adaptable observation, memory, cooperation, and technology suited to local waters. Watercraft may have been made from materials that rarely survive archaeologically, such as timber, bark, bamboo, reeds, or other plant fibers. Because such materials decay, the evidence remains incomplete. But the presence of people in Sahul itself is the strongest clue that some form of sea crossing took place. The journey is not accidental in any simple sense. Entire viable communities do not usually establish themselves on a new continent by drifting helplessly. The most grounded interpretation is that people possessed practical maritime knowledge, whether through rafts, simple boats, or other watercraft, and that they understood enough about tides, currents, weather, and group movement to make crossing possible. When they arrive, they do not enter a blank wilderness waiting for history to begin. They enter country before it has that name in English, but not before it has meaning. They enter a living continent of animals, plants, seasons, water sources, hazards, and opportunities. In the north, what is now Arnhem Land and the surrounding regions would have offered rich ecological zones, though not necessarily easy ones. There are stone escarpments, wetlands, savanna, woodland, and coasts that shift with sea level. To the south and inland, environments vary dramatically. Some regions offer reliable resources, others demand exact knowledge of timing and movement. The first people must learn quickly which plants are edible, which require processing, which animals can be tracked, where stones suitable for tools can be found, where dry season water remains, how fire behaves in different vegetation, how monsoon and drought reshape the land. Survival here is not a matter of simply being tough. It is a matter of becoming intelligently related to place. Over generations, that relationship deepens. The first arrival becomes occupation. Occupation becomes belonging. Belonging becomes lore, story, ceremony, and inheritance. It is important not to imagine this as instant or uniform. The peoples of Sahul spread, adapt, separate, reconnect, and create regional worlds. Some communities live with coast and reef, others with desert waterholes, others with rivers, mountains, forests, grasslands, or islands. As time passes, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania do not remain one easy whole. Sea levels rise and fall, climate patterns shift. A route that once exists may disappear beneath water. A plain may become a gulf. A hill may become an island. The geography of memory becomes layered, because people remember not only where they are, but where things have changed. This is one reason the story of Sahul matters so deeply to the idea of the world's oldest living cultures. Continuity begins not after people settle into stability, but while instability is normal. The first Australians and their ancestors lived through enormous environmental change. They do not preserve culture by refusing change. They preserve it by making change part of knowledge. A coastline moves, but sea country remains meaningful. A resource shifts, but seasonal intelligence adapts. A story holds a place, even if the place changes shape. Later oral traditions about inundation, islands, reefs, and drowned lands may preserve memories of post-Ice Age sea level rise, though scholars still debate how far back any individual tradition can be traced and how it should be interpreted. Even so, the possibility itself is astonishing. Memory may cling to landscape through forms that do not resemble archives, yet function as archives all the same. The road into Sahul is therefore not just a migration route. It is the beginning of a different way of understanding human history. the first people who reach Australia stand at the edge of what archaeology can easily prove and what living memory may continue to carry. Behind them lie Africa, Asia, island crossings, and countless unnamed generations. Ahead lies a continent where people will shape stone, use ochre, manage fire, paint rock, grind seeds, follow stars, sing roots, care for places, and build many distinct cultures whose descendants remain present. The crossing into Sahul is not a footnote to the human journey. It is one of its great turning points, the moment when modern humans enter the southern continent and begin a relationship with land and sea that will outlast ice ages, drowned coasts, lost species, and the rise and fall of civilizations elsewhere. The continent that receives these first people is not empty, and it is not simple. It is a living continent in the fullest and most demanding sense, a place where abundance and danger can sit only a few steps apart, where water may vanish from one place and gather secretly in another, where the same landscape can seem generous in one season and almost unreadable in the next. To arrive in Sahul is to enter a world of enormous variety. In the north, monsoon clouds build like dark mountains and release rain over floodplains. Escarpments, paperbark swamps, and open woodland. Rivers swell, wetlands spread, fish move, birds gather, and plants answer the season with sudden growth. Then the year turns, water retreats, mud hardens, heat settles over stone. The same country asks for different knowledge. Farther inland, deserts and semi-arid lands stretch under wide skies, but even there the word desert can mislead. These are not dead places. They are patterned places. Life gathers around soakages, clay pans, rock holes, ephemeral rivers, seed grasses, roots, lizards, insects, birds, and animals that know how to survive where careless strangers would see only distance. Along the ancient coasts, the world is just as intricate, because sea levels are lower. Many shorelines lie far beyond the modern beach. What is now open water may once have been plain, dune, lagoon, woodland, river mouth, mangrove, or reef edge. People moving through this world do not experience land and sea as separate realms. The coast is a shifting border of tides, shells, fish, crabs, birds, freshwater streams, storms, and seasonal signs. Sea country begins here not as a modern phrase, but as a relationship that will later be recognized across many First Nations traditions. Water with history, roots, responsibilities, names, and ancestors. To live beside such places requires more than gathering what is visible. It requires knowledge of timing. A reef can be generous at one tide and unreachable at another. A shell bed can feed people well if it is visited carefully and not exhausted. A channel can be safe under one wind and dangerous under another. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because so many ancient coastal sites are now submerged. But what survives in the record suggests that early communities were not passive wanderers. They were observers of fine detail, adjusting movement and memory to a coast that would later be transformed by rising seas. Inland, the first peoples encounter animals unlike any found in the landscapes their ancestors had known before. Ancient Sahul is home to megafauna giant marsupials, huge flightless birds, powerful reptiles, and other species that now seem almost dreamlike because they are gone. The details of their decline remain debated, and scholars still debate the relative roles of climate change, human activity, fire regimes, habitat shifts, and the vulnerability of slow-breeding species. No single explanation fully accounts for every region or every extinction, but for the people entering this world, These animals are not megafauna in the scientific sense. They are part of a living environment. Some are seen at distance, some leave tracks, some shape vegetation. Some may be known through caution, story, or repeated observation. Over time, as climates shift and species disappear, memories of strange animals may linger in forms that are difficult to test. It is tempting to make bold claims here, but the wiser path is careful. What survives in the record suggests overlapping timelines between people and some extinct species. While the cultural memory of lost animals remains a subject where archaeology, oral tradition, and interpretation must be handled with respect, the plants of Sahul are equally important and perhaps easier to underestimate. A person unfamiliar with Australian environments can walk past food without seeing it. Seeds may require grinding, nuts may need leaching or careful preparation. Roots may be edible only in certain conditions. Fruits appear briefly and then vanish. Some plants signal water nearby, others signal season, soil, or fire history. The deep knowledge needed to live well in these places is not invented in a single generation. It is accumulated, tested, corrected, and passed on. This is where one of the most significant clues to early cultural complexity appears. At ancient sites, archaeologists find grinding stones and plant processing tools, suggesting that people were not simply eating whatever could be picked up quickly. They were investing labour in foods that required technique. Such tools point toward planning, patience, and social knowledge. They also challenge old stereotypes that imagine early foragers as living in a crude, hand-to-mouth way. The early inhabitants of Sahul knew how to turn difficult landscapes into sustaining ones, not by dominating them in the later agricultural sense, but by reading them closely. Fire becomes part of this reading. Fire is warmth, light, cooking, protection, signalling, and technology. But in Australia it is also landscape knowledge. Used carefully, it can open paths, encourage new plant growth, attract animals to fresh shoots, reduce dangerous fuel loads, and maintain mosaics of vegetation. The exact antiquity and regional variation of fire management remain debated. Because natural fires also occur, and because the archaeological signatures of human burning can be difficult to separate from climate-driven fire patterns. Yet across later Aboriginal traditions, careful burning is not simply a tool, it is responsibility. Country is cared for through attention to timing, place, wind, fuel, and season. The roots of this relationship may reach far back, though the evidence must be read cautiously. What matters for the unfolding story is that people in Sahul are not merely adapting to environments, they are becoming participants in them, shaping and being shaped by country across deep time. To outsiders, this can be hard to grasp because the signs of such knowledge are often subtle. A city announces itself, a wall forces itself into the eye, a field system can be measured from above. But a seasonal route, a controlled burn, a food processing tradition, or a song that encodes where water lies may leave only faint archaeological traces. If the archive is stone, charcoal, bone, pigment, and sediment, then much of the most important human intelligence slips between the categories. Language disappears from the deep record, gesture disappears, teaching disappears, ceremony often leaves only hints, a wooden tool rots, a fibre bag vanishes, a bark vessel leaves no monument behind. This absence should not be mistaken for simplicity. One of the lesser-known truths of ancient Australia is that its oldest technologies may often have been made from the least durable materials. Stone survives not because it was always most important, but because it is stubborn. The living world was full of materials that decay, and with them goes a vast part of the ancient story. Still, enough remains to show that the first peoples of Sahul entered a continent that demanded intelligence at every scale. They needed broad maps in the mind, but also intimate attention to tiny signals. A bird call might matter, a flowering plant might announce a food source elsewhere. The position of a star might relate to seasonal change, the taste of water, the smell of rain on dry ground, the behavior of insects, the color of distant grass, the direction of smoke, the sound of surf beyond dunes. All of these could become part of knowledge. Over generations, that knowledge becomes cultural. It is not just useful information, it is embedded in kinship, law, obligation, story, song, ceremony, and place. This is why the continent should not be imagined as a stage on which human history happens. It is an active presence in the story. By the time communities spread across Sahul's coastlines, rivers, deserts, forests, and highlands, the mystery has deepened. The question is no longer simply how people arrived, it is how arrival became belonging. How did unfamiliar land become country? How did new coastlines become sea country? How did practical survival become story, and story become law, and law become continuity? The answer is not preserved in one object or one site. It is scattered across stone tools, pigments, ancient hearths, oral traditions, rock art, ecological knowledge, and living cultural practice. The first peoples did not step into a world waiting to be named by history. They stepped into a continent already alive, and through countless acts of attention, care, movement, and memory, they began to make that life part of themselves. The first traces that bring this deep story out of the shadows are not grand monuments. They are smaller, quieter things, flakes of stone, worn grinding surfaces, pieces of ochre, charcoal, sediment, and the faint architecture of repeated human presence. At Madjedbebe, in Mirror Country in northern Australia, archaeology opens one of the most important windows onto the earliest known occupation of the continent. The place sits in the stone country of Arnhem Land, where sandstone shelters hold shade, memory, and layers of time. To stand before such a site is to feel how easily the ancient past could be missed. There is no pyramid rising from the plain, no broken palace wall, no inscription announcing a king. The evidence lies in earth, in careful excavation squares, in microscopic grains, in stone scarred by deliberate blows, in pigments carried and used by people whose names are beyond recovery, but whose presence is not. Madjedbebe matters because it pushes the story of humans in Australia back to a staggering depth. Excavations have produced evidence interpreted by researchers as human occupation by around 65,000 years ago, though scholars still debate aspects of the dating, site formation, and how the earliest layers should be understood. The caution is important. Deep time archaeology is not a simple act of finding an object and reading its age like a label. Sediments move. Burrows disturb layers. Water, roots, insects, and later human activity can complicate the record. Dating methods such as optically stimulated luminescence estimate when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight before burial, while charcoal and other organic traces may offer different kinds of chronological clues where they survive. Every method has strengths, limits, and margins of error. Yet the overall picture at Madjedbebe remains powerful. People were present in northern Australia far earlier than the rise of agriculture, far earlier than the first city, and far earlier than almost every familiar landmark of ancient history. The objects themselves change the atmosphere of the story. Stone artifacts show people striking and shaping material with intention. Some flakes are practical and sharp, made for cutting, scraping, or processing. Other tools suggest more specialized tasks. Among the most striking finds are edge-ground axes, a technology that appears astonishingly early in the Australian record. In many parts of the world, ground-edge stone axes are associated with much later periods, often tied to forests, woodworking and settled or semi-settled lifeways. At Madjedbebe, their early presence suggests that the people of Sahul are not merely carrying a simple toolkit into a new world. They are innovating, adapting, and making tools suited to local materials and tasks. What survives in the record suggests a community able to think beyond immediate needs, to shape stone carefully, to maintain knowledge of manufacture, and to pass that knowledge between hands. Ochre adds another layer. Pieces of pigment from early levels at Madjedbebe suggest that colour mattered. Ochre can be used for many purposes. It may be practical, mixed into compounds, used in hide working, applied to tools, or involved in body decoration, art, ceremony, and symbolic expression. Archaeology cannot always tell which use applies in a particular moment, and no single explanation fully accounts for every piece of pigment found in ancient sites. But the presence of ochre deep in the record is a reminder that human life is not only food and stone. People carry colour because colour has meaning. It can mark bodies, objects, places, relationships, and events. A small piece of red or yellow earth, scraped and carried into a shelter, may hold a world of intention that the soil preserves only in fragments. Grinding stones are just as important, perhaps even more surprising to anyone still imagining early Australia as a place of simple wandering. Grinding technology points toward plant processing, seed use, and foods that require effort before they become edible. This is a different kind of intelligence from the dramatic image of a hunt. It is slower, more patient, and deeply tied to season. Seeds must be gathered at the right time. Some need cleaning, pounding, grinding, soaking, or cooking. Stones used for grinding may become worn through repeated movement, preserving a record of hands and foods that otherwise vanish. In a climate where organic remains are often fragile, a grinding surface becomes a rare witness to daily knowledge. It suggests that early communities understood not only where food was, but how to transform it. This is one of the lesser-known strengths of the Madjedbebe evidence. It reveals complexity without needing a city. There is planning in the selection of stone. There is technical skill in shaping axes. There is symbolic possibility in ochre. There is ecological knowledge in grinding. There is repeated occupation in the layered remains of activity. None of these require farming, writing, or permanent architecture. They require something older and perhaps more flexible, a social world in which people learn from one another and from country. The shelter is not just a place where individuals pause, it is part of a wider pattern of movement, resource use, memory, and return. People come back because the place matters. Shade matters. Stone nearby matters. Water and food within reach matter. The knowledge of when to be there matters. Madjedbebe also forces a wider question. If people are in northern Australia by about 65,000 years ago, then the journey into Sahul must begin earlier still. The sea crossings, the movement through island Southeast Asia, the testing of routes, the establishment of viable communities. All of this must precede the layer archaeologists excavate. The site is not the beginning of the story in an absolute sense. It is the earlier strong doorway currently visible. Older evidence may exist elsewhere, perhaps beneath sediments, perhaps lost to rising seas, perhaps still waiting in places not yet excavated, perhaps gone forever. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a weakness of the story. It is part of its scale. The oldest traces we can see are almost certainly not the first moments that happened. The stone country around Madjedbebe gives the story a powerful sense of place. Imagine a shelter at the edge of changing light, its walls holding coolness while the day heats outside. People sit where stone offers protection. A toolmaker turns raw material in the hand, deciding where to strike. Someone grinds pigment or plant food. Smoke rises and thins. Beyond the shelter, birds move across the wetland or woodland, and seasonal signs tell those who know them what is changing. No written record explains the scene. No ancient voice narrates it for us. Archaeology gives only pieces, and the rest must be inferred with restraint. But the pieces are enough to show that these were not people at the edge of humanity. They were fully modern humans at the edge of a new continent, carrying knowledge, imagination, technology, and social life into deep time. Madjedbebe is therefore more than an old site. It is a challenge to the way history is often imagined. If civilization is measured only by cities, walls, kings, and writing, then most of the human story is treated as a long waiting room before history begins. But the earliest evidence in Australia refuses that narrow measure. Here are people using complex toolkits, processing plants, using pigments, adapting to a continent with no instruction manual, and beginning cultural relationships whose descendants still speak of country today. The mystery is not that they lacked monuments. The mystery is that so much could endure without them. Stone flakes, axes, ochre, grinding stones, and sediment carry the first visible clues, but behind them stands something larger, a human world already rich with memory, skill, and meaning. To call this story the world's oldest living culture is to reach for a phrase large enough to hold deep time. But the phrase needs careful handling. If it is spoken too quickly, it can flatten what it is trying to honour. It can make Australia sound as if it contained one ancient culture, unchanged and uniform, stretching back across 50,000 years like a single unbroken line. The reality is more profound than that, and far more complex. What lives on the continent and across the islands is not one culture in the simple sense, but a vast constellation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, each with its own country, sea country, language, law, identity, stories, ceremonies, and historical experience. Continuity here does not mean sameness. It means that many distinct cultural worlds have kept renewing their relationships with place, generation after generation, through change, pressure, invention, disruption. And return. This distinction matters because deep time can easily become abstract. Numbers like 50,000 or 65,000 years are so large that they begin to float away from human life. They can become impressive but empty. Yet the living cultures of First Nations Australia are not abstractions. They are made of named places, families, responsibilities, seasonal knowledge, kinship, language groups, ancestral beings, ceremonial obligations, food practices, artistic traditions, and ways of teaching younger generations without treating knowledge as a loose possession. Country is not interchangeable. A person's relationship to one stretch of river, one coastline, one desert track, one island, one stone outcrop, one waterhole, one reef, or one mountain cannot simply be swapped for another. Place is not merely where culture happens. Place is part of culture itself. Across Australia, different peoples developed different ways of living with sharply different environments. In the north, tropical monsoon worlds demanded knowledge of wet and dry seasons, floodplains, fish traps, water birds, crocodile country, yams, fruits, stone shelters, and coastal routes. In the central deserts, survival depended on memory of water, seed foods, fire, tracks, soakages, ceremonial pathways, and the fine signs of plants and animals responding to rare rain. In the southeast, rivers, grasslands, woodlands, mountains, and coasts supported their own seasonal patterns and technologies. In Tasmania, isolation after sea level rise created a different history again. In the Torres Strait, island and sea worlds connected peoples to reef, canoe travel, gardening, fishing, trade, and navigation. These are not minor variations around a single theme. They are distinct cultural landscapes formed through long relationships with country and sea country. The phrase many countries can sound unusual to ears trained by modern political maps, where a country is a nation-state with borders printed in ink. But in First Nations contexts, country carries another depth. It is land, water, sky, ancestors, law, plants, animals, stories, and human responsibility held together. It can include the visible and the invisible, the practical and the sacred. A waterhole is not just a water source. A reef is not just a place to fish. A hill is not just elevation. A track is not merely a route between resources. Each can belong to a web of meaning that teaches how people should live, where they may go, what they must care for, which stories are told, which ceremonies are performed, and which obligations belong to whom. The evidence remains incomplete when archaeology alone tries to hold this reality, because stone tools cannot fully preserve law, and sediment cannot fully preserve kinship. This is one reason the story of First Nations Australia resists the usual categories used for ancient civilizations. In many parts of the world, historians are trained to look for centralization cities, kings, monuments, administrative systems, armies, written records, and fields. But long cultural survival in Australia often works through decentralization and local depth. Authority is not expressed through a single capital city rising over the landscape. It is embedded in networks of knowledge, kinship, seniority, ceremony, and place. Law is not absent because there is no palace. Memory is not weak because there is no archive building. Governance is not primitive because it does not resemble a kingdom. These societies are organized through systems that outsiders often fail to understand because they were looking for the wrong signs. A lesser-known detail in this wider story is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures were never sealed away from change or contact. Trade routes crossed enormous distances. Materials, songs, designs, stories, and technologies could move from group to group, though not randomly and not without meaning. Certain stone, ochre, shells, pituri, wooden objects, and ceremonial knowledge travelled through exchange networks that linked distant peoples. In northern Australia, long before British colonisation, there were contacts between Aboriginal communities and seafarers from Makassar in present-day Indonesia, especially around trepang fishing. These later contacts did not create Aboriginal maritime knowledge, which was already deep and regionally varied, but they remind us that the continent was not a silent, isolated world. It had histories of encounter, negotiation, adoption, resistance, and adaptation. This matters for deep continuity because living cultures do not survive by refusing all outside influence. They survive by deciding how change is absorbed, controlled, resisted, translated, or made meaningful. A new material can be taken into an old system. A new word can enter a language. A new route can connect to an older story. A ceremony can respond to crisis. A law can continue while its outward expression shifts. Scholars still debate how to trace such changes across thousands of years, because the archaeological record catches some moments and misses many others. But the broad point is clear: First Nations cultures are not ancient because they stood still. They are ancient because they kept moving through time without losing the deep structure of relationship to country. Language reveals this diversity especially strongly. Before colonisation, Australia held hundreds of Aboriginal languages, along with distinct Torres Strait Islander languages, each carrying its own worldview, categories, names, ecological observations, and histories. Language is more than vocabulary. It can encode relationships among people, directions in space, knowledge of plants and animals, kinship obligations, and the correct way to refer to places or beings. Some languages are still spoken strongly, others are endangered, others have been sleeping and are now being revived through community effort, recordings, archives, elders, and younger speakers. This revival work is part of the living story. It shows that continuity can include recovery. It also shows the cost of disruption. When a language is attacked, the damage is not only linguistic, it touches memory, identity, law, and country. The idea of many cultures also protects the story from another mistake, treating First Nations peoples only as representatives of the ancient past. They are contemporary peoples, not living fossils. Their cultures belong to the present as much as to deep time. People drive cars, use phones, work in cities, study at universities, create contemporary art, make films, fight legal battles, protect sacred sites, revive language, care for country, and continue ceremony. None of this makes their cultures less ancient. A culture does not lose its depth because its people live in the modern world. The assumption that authenticity requires isolation is one of the more damaging myths inherited from colonial thinking. Living continuity means being able to carry old responsibilities into new conditions. So the mystery becomes richer. It is not a single line stretching unchanged from the Ice Age to now. It is a network of lines, crossing and separating, thickening and thinning, broken in places and renewed in others, tied always to country and sea country. The oldest living culture is better understood as the oldest living cultural continuum: many peoples, many laws, many languages, many memories, many ways of belonging, held across a continent and its seas. The power of the story lies precisely there. Deep time is not preserved as a fossil. It is carried in relationship. It is sung, danced, painted, spoken, guarded, adapted, and lived. Country is not simply a place beneath the feet. In the deepest sense of First Nations knowledge, country is alive with relationship. It holds people, but it also speaks back through water, fire, stone, animals, plants, wind, stars, ancestors, and law. To say that a person belongs to country is not the same as saying they live on land or own land in the modern legal sense. It means that identity, responsibility, story, and place are woven together so tightly that removing one strand changes the whole pattern. A river may carry food, but it also carries memory. A reef may provide fish, but it also carries names, roots, and obligations. A desert waterhole may save life, but it may also belong to a story that teaches who may approach, how it must be cared for, and what must never be forgotten there. The landscape is not a blank surface on which culture is painted. It is a partner in culture, a living archive that cannot be separated from the people who know it. This is one of the most important shifts needed to understand the long survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. In many Western historical traditions, memory is imagined as something stored in documents, monuments, libraries, temples, inscriptions, or archives. But in First Nations worlds, memory can be stored in movement, performance, place, and obligation. A hill can hold part of a story. A bend in a river can mark an event. A pattern of stars can tell when a food is ready, when weather will turn, or when a ceremony belongs. A route across country can be both a practical path and a remembered ancestral journey. Knowledge is not always separated into categories like geography, religion, history, ecology, and law. It may be all of these at once. What survives in the record suggests that such systems are not recent inventions laid over an empty past. They grow from an old and intimate attention to place. Though scholars still debate exactly how far back any particular story, practice, or route can be traced. Country also teaches through limits. Not every story is told to everyone. Not every place is open to everyone. Knowledge may be shared according to age, kinship, responsibility, gender, initiation, or community authority. This can be difficult for outside observers to understand, especially when they expect knowledge to be public, extractable, and available for academic classification. But restricted knowledge is not secrecy in a shallow sense. It can be a form of care. If a place is powerful, fragile, dangerous, sacred, or culturally sensitive, then knowledge about it may need protection. If a story carries lore, then hearing it may bring responsibility. If a site holds ancestral presence, then entering it casually may be not only disrespectful, but harmful to the relationships that keep country balanced. The evidence remains incomplete when seen only through archaeology, because the most important rules are not always carved into stone. They live in the social systems that govern who can know, speak, paint, sing, visit, and care. Sea country carries this same depth beyond the shoreline. It includes reefs, islands, tides, currents, channels, sandbanks, seagrass, fish, turtles, dugong, storms, and submerged places. To modern maps, the coast is often a dividing line, land on one side, ocean on the other. But for many coastal and island peoples, that line is too simple. The sea is not emptiness. It is country with movement. It has paths, seasons, dangers, names, resources, and histories. It can hold places that were once dry land before post-Ice Age sea level rise. It can hold ancestral stories that continue beneath water. In this sense, rising seas did not erase country. They transformed how country was known, reached, and remembered. No single explanation fully accounts for the age and continuity of every inundation story, and researchers must be cautious when connecting oral traditions to geological events. Yet the possibility that some memories of drowned coastlines have survived for thousands of years reveals how powerful place-based knowledge can be when it is embedded in story and passed through disciplined cultural forms. Law, in this world, is not merely a set of rules imposed from outside. It is a way of living correctly within relationships. It can govern marriage, kinship, resource use, ceremony, responsibilities to animals and plants, access to places, conduct between people, obligations to ancestors, and the care of country itself. Traditional law is not separate from the land that holds it. A story may explain why a water source must be protected. A ceremony may renew ties between people and place. A seasonal practice may ensure that resources are used carefully. A prohibition may preserve ecological balance as well as spiritual order. Outsiders have often failed to see this because they expected law to look like written codes, courts, police, and centralized authority. But law can also be carried in memory, enacted in ceremony, taught through story, and enforced through kinship and responsibility. This relationship between law and landscape is one reason continuity can endure through transformation. If a coastline changes, the law attached to care does not simply vanish. It may be reinterpreted through the new shape of country. If people move after drought, flood, conflict, or colonial disruption, obligations may travel with them or remain tied to places that must still be remembered. If a language is weakened, names and stories may be protected through other languages, art, ceremony, or community revival. Continuity is not always smooth. It can be strained, interrupted, wounded, and contested. But it is not fragile in the way a written archive is fragile. A library can burn, a monument can be smashed, a document can disappear into a drawer. A living system of law and memory can be carried in bodies, voices, gestures, songs, roots, and repeated acts of care. One lesser-known aspect of this deep relationship is the precision of ecological memory. Knowledge of country can include when particular fish move, when eels migrate, when birds nest, when yams are ready, when grasses seed, when shellfish should be left alone, when burning is safe, when water is likely to remain in hidden places, and how animal behavior signals seasonal change. Such knowledge is not folklore in the dismissive sense. It is tested environmental observation accumulated across generations. It can be encoded in story in ways that make it memorable and morally binding. A story about an ancestral being may also teach a route. A song may hold a map. A ceremony may renew responsibilities to species and places. The practical and the sacred are not opposing categories. They strengthen one another. This is where the ancient mystery becomes especially vivid. How does memory survive tens of thousands of years without becoming dust? It survives because it is not left alone. It is performed, walked, sung, danced, taught, corrected, guarded, and renewed. It is attached to places that people return to, or to places they continue to name even when access is threatened. It is held by elders, families, artists, rangers, language workers, ceremonial leaders, and communities who understand that knowledge is not merely information, it is responsibility. The outside world may call this heritage, but heritage can sound like something behind us. For many First Nations peoples, country is not behind. It is present. It is a living relation that continues to ask for care. And so the great age of these cultures cannot be understood only by counting years from an archaeological layer. Madjedbebe, rock art, ancient hearths, and drowned landscapes give the story deep evidence, but country gives it meaning. Without country, the past becomes a collection of objects. With country, the objects return to relationship. A stone tool is not only technology, ochre is not only pigment, a rock wall is not only art, a reef is not only ecology. Each belongs to a wider world of memory and lore. The oldest living culture is alive because the land and sea are not treated as silent remains of the past. They are still speaking, and people are still listening. If country is the living archive, then song, dance, story, ceremony, and language are among the ways that archive is opened, renewed, and carried forward. They are not decorations added to practical life after the important work is done. They are part of the important work itself. In many First Nations traditions, knowledge does not survive because it is removed from daily life and stored somewhere safe. It survives because it is repeated with care, performed in the right context, taught by the right people, and connected to the places that give it authority. A story may seem, to an outsider, like a tale about ancestral beings or distant events, but within its own cultural world, it can also hold instructions about movement, behavior, kinship, food, water, danger, responsibility, and the proper relationship between human beings and everything around them. This is where the written world often misunderstands the oral world. A book looks stable because the words remain on the page, while a song seems fragile because it must be remembered. Yet performance can be a powerful technology of memory. Rhythm helps hold sequence. Melody helps hold detail. Repetition helps correct mistakes. Dance gives knowledge a body. Ceremony gives it authority. Place gives it direction. Language gives it precision. When these elements work together, memory is not left floating in the mind of one person. It is distributed through community, movement, landscape, and responsibility. It is rehearsed at the right season, in the right place, with the right people present. The evidence remains incomplete when scholars try to measure such systems only through objects, because the most important part of the record may vanish the moment the song ends, unless someone carries it onward. Songlines are one of the most widely known examples, though the word is often used too loosely. They are not merely songs about travel. In many contexts, they connect places across country through ancestral journeys, names, verses, melodies, and responsibilities. A songline can be a route, a map, a history, a law, and a relationship at the same time. It may cross the lands of more than one people, requiring knowledge of who has authority to speak for each part. It may encode landmarks, water sources, species, seasonal signals, and the correct order of places. It may connect Earth to sky, because stars too can become part of navigation and memory. Scholars still debate how far back particular songlines can be traced, and it would be careless to treat every present tradition as an unchanged Ice Age survival. But it is equally careless to underestimate the durability of knowledge when it is anchored in place and renewed through disciplined performance. Storytelling works in a similar way, but it should not be reduced to entertainment. Stories can teach caution near certain waters, respect for particular animals, the dangers of greed, the importance of kinship, the origin of landforms, or the reason a place must be approached with care. They can carry ecological knowledge in forms that are memorable, because they are emotionally and morally charged. A plain story of instruction may be forgotten, a story tied to an ancestor, a place, a season. And a consequence can endure because it matters on several levels at once. This is one reason oral traditions can sometimes preserve details that surprise researchers, including memories that appear to correspond with ancient shoreline change or unusual geological events. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, and not every story should be forced into a scientific frame. Some stories are not public, some belong to specific people. Some should not be translated into outsider categories, but the possibility that oral tradition can carry deep environmental memory is central to this wider mystery. Dance adds another layer because it turns knowledge into movement. A gesture can evoke an animal, a journey, a relationship, a plant, a wave, a bird, a star, or an ancestral action. Bodies remember in ways that words alone do not. Steps can mark direction. Formations can show relationship. Repeated movements can teach younger people how to belong within a larger order without turning knowledge into a lecture. In parts of the Torres Strait, for example, song and dance have long been tied to seafaring, stars, social structure, and cultural continuity. Though each island and community has its own traditions and authority, across Aboriginal Australia, dance may accompany ceremony, celebration, mourning, teaching, diplomacy, and renewal. It can be public in some contexts and restricted in others. It can welcome, warn, honour, remember, and reaffirm law. Ceremony gives all of this a deeper frame. It is through ceremony that relationships are renewed not only among people, but between people and country, ancestors, species, seasons, and law. Ceremony can mark life stages, maintain connections to place, transmit knowledge, affirm rights and responsibilities, and repair or strengthen social bonds. It is not a performance for outside spectators, even when some forms are shared publicly. It is a living practice with protocols, authority, and meaning. The outside observer may see paint, movement, sound, and fire. The community may understand obligations being fulfilled, ancestral presence being acknowledged, and country being cared for. What survives in the archaeological record may be only pigment, charcoal, a cleared space, an arrangement of stones, or nothing at all. The living meaning is held in practice. Language binds the system together. Place names are not simple labels. They can hold stories, warnings, classifications, relationships, and histories. Words for plants and animals may include distinctions that outsiders miss. Kinship terms may map social duties with remarkable precision. Directional language may keep speakers oriented to landscape rather than to the left and right of an individual body. Ceremonial vocabulary may carry meanings that cannot be casually translated. When a language weakens, a whole library of relations is placed at risk. When a language is revived, something larger than vocabulary returns. The revival of sleeping languages, the recording of elders, the careful teaching of younger generations, the return of names to maps and public places, all of these are modern acts of ancient continuity. This does not mean that every song, dance, story, ceremony, or word can be traced back unchanged for 50,000 years. That would be the wrong claim. Living traditions breathe. They respond to marriage, travel, trade, loss, colonization, mission histories, urban life, new media, legal struggles, and community renewal. Some knowledge has been interrupted, some has been guarded quietly, some has been adapted into contemporary music, painting, film, education, ranger work, and public ceremony. Continuity here is not a straight line without breaks. It is more like a river system. Some channels dry for a time, some are blocked, some are fed by underground water, some rejoin after distance, and some continue with astonishing force. So when First Nations cultures are described as maintained through song, dance, storytelling, ceremony, and language, the statement is not poetic exaggeration. It is a description of an archive that lives by being practiced. This archive is not open in the same way to everyone, and it should not be treated as a storehouse for outsiders to empty. It belongs to peoples, countries, and sea countries. It is governed by law. It is carried with care, and across the long night of human history. While cities elsewhere rise, burn, and vanish into mounds, these forms of memory continue to do what stone alone cannot. They keep place alive in the mind, and they keep people responsible to place. Long before words are pressed into clay or carved into temple walls, stone is already carrying memory in Australia, across cliffs, caves, shelters, boulders, and open rock surfaces. Images appear: hands, animals, human figures, tracks, geometric marks, ancestral beings, fish, turtles, kangaroos, birds, weapons, boats, spirits, and shapes whose full meanings are not for outsiders to claim. Some are painted with ochre and other pigments on sheltered walls. Some are engraved into stone by pecking, pounding, abrading, or cutting the surface. Some are bold and visible from a distance. Others are faint, weathered, layered, half hidden in shadow or lichen, as if time itself has been breathing over them. They're often called rock art, but that term can feel too small. Art, in the modern gallery sense, is only one doorway into them. In many First Nations contexts, these places may also be law, ceremony, story, teaching, warning, ancestral presence, territorial knowledge, ecological memory, and continuing responsibility. To look at Australian rock art is to feel the limits of ordinary history. In a written archive, a document may carry a date, a name, a ruler, a transaction, a witness. A painted wall rarely gives itself away so easily. Pigment may be made from ochre, clay, charcoal, or other materials. The image may be repainted many times across generations. A figure may belong to a recent layer placed over an older one. A shelter may contain thousands of years of activity, not as a neat sequence, but as a dense conversation between people, place, and time. Dating such images is one of the most difficult tasks in archaeology. Sometimes researchers can date mineral crusts that formed above or below a painting. Sometimes charcoal pigment can be radiocarbon dated if enough survives and if contamination can be controlled. Sometimes a wasp nest, a mud layer, or a buried floor offers a clue. Sometimes style, subject matter, and superimposition help build a relative sequence. But the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the age of many images. That uncertainty does not weaken their importance. It makes them more haunting. A rock wall may contain a painting that is centuries old beside one that is thousands of years old, beside marks whose age cannot yet be known. The wall is not a single moment. It is a living surface returned to again and again. In some places, older images are covered by younger ones not as vandalism, but as continuation, renewal, or the proper layering of meaning through time. In other places, an image may remain visible for so long that later generations encounter it as ancestral presence. The rock becomes not a dead background but a participant in memory. A person may stand before a figure painted long before their birth and still relate to it through story, ceremony, and country. Kakadu is one of the places where this layered depth becomes visible to the wider world. Its shelters and escarpments hold paintings that speak across many periods of environmental and cultural change. Some images show animals that belong to wetland worlds. Others show fish, turtles, wallabies, and human figures. There are dynamic scenes, delicate internal details, and later images that include contact-era subjects. What matters is not simply that the art is old, but that it shows continuity through change. The landscape around Kakadu has not always looked as it does now. Seas have risen. Freshwater and saltwater environments have shifted. Floodplains have formed. Species distributions have changed. Human communities have responded. Rock art in such places can preserve not one frozen world, but a record of changing relationships with country. Ochre is central to this story. It is earth made into colour, but also much more than colour: red, yellow, white, and other pigments may be gathered from known sources, processed, mixed, traded, stored, and applied with care. In some regions, ochre sources themselves are culturally important. The journey to obtain pigment may matter, the act of preparing it may matter, the colour may be tied to ceremony, body painting, burial practices, tools, objects, and rock images. A fragment of ochre in an ancient layer can seem modest, but it opens onto a world where the visual, the symbolic, and the practical overlap. At sites such as Madjedbebe, the early use of ochre suggests that pigment has belonged to human life in Australia from very deep time, though it would be careless to claim that every later artistic tradition can be traced directly and unchanged to the earliest pigment use. What survives in the record suggests deep antiquity. Living traditions show continuing meaning. The exact lines between them remain complex. Engraved landscapes add another dimension. Unlike pigment on shelter walls, petroglyphs can spread across exposed stone in the open air, over ridges, pavements, boulders, and slopes. They may be worn by weather and yet endure for astonishing lengths of time. Murujuga, in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, is one of the most remarkable examples on Earth, with an immense concentration of petroglyphs across a land and seascape of deep, cultural significance. Some engravings may be very ancient, while others are much more recent, creating a vast archive of changing subjects, techniques, and meanings. This place deserves its own longer attention, because it is not only an archaeological landscape, but a living cultural landscape under continuing care and concern. For now, it stands as a reminder that Australia's ancient record is not hidden only underground. In some places, it lies open beneath the sun, carved into stone by generations whose descendants continue to speak for country. One lesser-known difficulty in studying rock art is that the most visible image is not always the most important clue. A faded outline may matter because it sits beneath another figure. A small mineral film may reveal that an image must be older than the crust above it. A painted animal may indicate an environment that once existed nearby. A boat shape might suggest contact, travel, or a later historical moment. A hand stencil may preserve the presence of a person without preserving their name. Researchers may use chemistry, microscopy, digital enhancement, ethnographic knowledge, community collaboration, and landscape study to understand such places. But there is always a boundary. Some meanings are not available to archaeology. Some knowledge is restricted. Some images belong to living lore and should not be treated as puzzles for outsiders to solve. The phrase rock art can also accidentally make these places sound passive, as if their value lies only in being looked at. But many image sites are not merely visual records. They may be places people visit, care for, avoid, teach at, sing to, speak about, or protect. They may sit along travel routes, near water, close to resources, or within ceremonial landscapes. Their power may come from the relationship between image and place. A fish painted far from the modern sea may hold a memory of ecological change, or may belong to a story that is not reducible to environment. A spirit figure may not be an illustration of a myth, but part of the presence of that being in country. A hand on stone may not say "I was here" in the modern individual sense. It may say something wider: people were here, belong here, returned here, and knew how to make presence visible. In the long story of the world's oldest living cultures, rock walls matter because they give deep time a face without reducing it to writing. They do not tell the whole story. They cannot replace language, ceremony, or living authority. but they allow a glimpse of continuity that is both material and mysterious. The hand, the animal, the track, the engraved line, the painted form, the layered wall, each becomes a meeting point between archaeology and memory. Cities elsewhere will rise with their tablets and royal names. Many will fall. Their scripts will be forgotten until scholars labour to read them again. In Australia, stone holds another kind of record, one that has never belonged only to the past. It remains in country, exposed to weather, protected by communities, studied with caution, and still speaking in ways that are not always meant to be translated. Murujuga asks for a slower gaze. It is not a single cave, not one painted wall hidden in shade, not a neat archaeological site with clear edges and a simple beginning. It is a land and seascape of stone, island, coast, memory, lore, and extraordinary density, spread across the Burrup Peninsula and the Dampier Archipelago in the Pilbara of Western Australia. The country is hard, bright, and ancient-looking even before one understands what lies on its rocks. Boulders lie in fields and ridges, their surfaces darkened by mineral skin, their shapes catching the sun in ways that make the whole landscape seem awake. Then the eye begins to notice marks, lines, figures, tracks, animals, human forms, geometric patterns, images pecked and abraded into the stone, not in dozens, not in thousands, but in numbers so vast that the mind struggles to hold them. Murujuga is often described as holding one of the largest, densest, and most diverse collections of petroglyphs on Earth. Perhaps more than 1 million images, possibly closer to 2 million, yet even that number is only a doorway. The deeper fact is that these images belong to a living cultural landscape, still held by traditional owners, still connected to lore, story, care, and responsibility. The stones of Murujuga do not speak in one age. They carry many ages layered across the same land. Some engravings may be very ancient, reaching back toward the last Ice Age, while others belong to later periods, including times when sea levels, animals, coastlines, and human lifeways had changed. Dating petroglyphs is difficult, and scholars still debate the exact age of many images. Unlike charcoal in a hearth, a carved line in stone does not automatically provide an easy date. Researchers may study weathering, varnish, patina, superimposition, style, subject matter, nearby archaeological deposits, and the changing environment to build sequences, but the evidence remains incomplete. Still, the pattern is powerful. Murujuga appears to preserve a long record of people returning to stone, making marks, renewing presence, and recording relationships with a world that did not stay the same. The setting itself has changed dramatically. During the Ice Age, when seas were lower, parts of what are now islands, channels, and coastal waters would have formed a different landscape. Places now divided by sea may once have been connected or more easily reached. As the climate warmed and ice melted, the ocean rose, swallowing plains, reshaping shores, turning hills into islands, and transforming travel routes. Murujuga therefore holds not only rock art on land, but memory of a larger world around land and sea. It is a reminder that sea country is not an empty blue space beside culture. It is part of culture. The drowned margins, channels, reefs, and islands matter because they belong to the same long story of people and place. A modern visitor may see a coast. Traditional knowledge may hold a much wider map, one that includes what has changed, what remains, and what must still be cared for. The images themselves are astonishing in their variety. There are animals that belong to the region, tracks and figures, human forms, marine life, birds, and designs whose meanings may not be public or may not be reducible to simple labels. Some engravings appear to reflect older environments. Some may show animals no longer found in that place. Some motifs have been interpreted in relation to extinct species, though such interpretations require caution. It is tempting to turn every ancient image into a scientific clue, but that can narrow its meaning. An engraving may be ecological evidence, but it may also be law, ceremony, ancestry, teaching, or an act of renewal. No single explanation fully accounts for why each mark was made. A figure carved into stone can belong to several kinds of truth at once. One lesser-known detail is the way Murujuga's rock surfaces help preserve this archive. The boulders often carry a dark outer coating, sometimes called rock varnish or patina, and when people engraved them, they exposed lighter stone beneath. Over time, the exposed marks weathered and darkened again. This process can help researchers think about relative age, because older engravings may appear more weathered, while newer ones may look lighter. Though the reality is never perfectly straightforward, sun, rain, chemistry, slope, rock type, and local conditions all complicate the story. The stones preserve, but they do not do so with the tidy discipline of a library shelf. They preserve like a landscape unevenly, beautifully, and with many secrets still hidden in plain sight. Murujuga also changes how ancient creativity is understood. These are not casual scratches made by people with spare time. Many petroglyphs required technical skill, patience, and knowledge of stone. Pecking an image into hard rock is physical work. It takes repeated blows, controlled movement, and an understanding of surface. Across generations, different techniques and styles appear, suggesting not one brief moment of marking, but a long artistic and cultural tradition. The images do not merely show that people were present. They show that people were interpreting the world, making relationships visible, and placing memory into country with care. This is why Murujuga can feel less like an outdoor gallery, and more like a deep-time archive that has never stopped belonging to its people. Its recent recognition as a World Heritage landscape is important, but it does not create its value. The value was already there. The recognition names something the traditional owners have long known and cared for, that this is a place of extraordinary cultural, spiritual, artistic, and historical significance. The listing also brings attention to protection, and protection is not an abstract issue. Murujuga exists alongside modern industrial development, and concerns have long been raised about emissions, physical disturbance, monitoring, and the future of the petroglyphs. The details are debated among governments, industry, scientists, conservationists, and traditional owner groups, and the science of impact can be complex. But the moral centre is not complex. A place that carries such deep human memory should not be treated as expendable. The living care of Murujuga matters as much as its age. If the stones are seen only as ancient objects, they can be admired and still misunderstood. They're not simply remnants from people long gone. They belong to continuing cultural authority. Traditional owners, including Ngada people represented through community structures, speak for this country and its law. Their role is not decorative, it is fundamental. Archaeology can help study the images, but it cannot replace the people whose responsibilities are tied to the place. Science can examine surfaces, dates, and environmental change, but it cannot decide the full meaning of Murujuga alone. The oldest living cultures are living precisely because knowledge, care, and authority continue. Murujuga stands, then, as one of the strongest answers to the mistaken idea that Australia's deep past is silent. Here the past is almost overwhelming in its abundance. Stone after stone carries a mark, ridge after ridge holds evidence of return. Land and sea together preserve a record of changing environments and continuing relationship, but the mystery remains open. How many images have been lost to weather, sea, quarrying, or time? How many meanings are restricted, forgotten, guarded, or still known only within proper cultural contexts? How many ancient coastal places lie beneath the water nearby, holding traces that would change the story again? The archive is immense, but not complete. And perhaps that is what makes Murujuga so powerful. It does not offer the comfort of a finished answer. It offers presence. It shows people in deep time not as shadows waiting for civilization, but as artists, observers, law holders, travellers, and custodians of place. It shows that memory can be cut into stone, but also that stone alone is never enough. The rock art endures because country endures, because sea country endures, and because living people continue to care for what the stones hold. Under the Pilbara sun, the dark boulders keep their old surfaces, and across them the marks remain not silent, not simple, not safely past, but still part of a living world. From the sunstruck stones of Murujuga, the story turns inward, into darkness, into a cave where the archive is not spread across ridges in millions of marks, but hidden in small burned patches of earth. Clogg's Cave lies in Guinea country in southeastern Australia, near Buchan in what is now East Gippsland. Victoria, on Krawatungalung country. It is not a place that announces itself in the manner of a great monument. Its power is quieter. The cave draws the mind away from the open landscape and into a more enclosed world, where sound changes, light weakens, and the ordinary rules of daily activity seem to fall away. Archaeology has long known Clogg's Cave as an important site, but recent work has made it one of the most extraordinary places in the story of cultural continuity anywhere on Earth. Here, buried in cave sediment, researchers working with Guinea knowledge holders identified small fireplaces, each holding a trimmed wooden stick, preserved across a span of roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years. The discovery is startling partly because it is so modest at first glance. These are not golden objects, not statues, not written tablets, not monumental tombs. They are little fires and pieces of wood. Yet the smallness is exactly what makes them powerful. Organic materials rarely survive so long. Wood usually decays, fat disappears, fireplaces are disturbed, washed away, or mistaken for ordinary traces of daily life. But in Clogg's Cave, the conditions protected something fragile enough that it should almost not be there. The wooden artifacts were made from casuarina, shaped and placed in miniature hearths, and analysis found traces consistent with fat smeared onto them. The fires appear too small and too unusual to be ordinary cooking hearths. They were set deep in a cave not used like a normal domestic campsite. The evidence suggests a special purpose installation, something done deliberately in a secluded place, with actions repeated according to a known pattern. What makes the find even more unusual is the connection to Guinea cultural knowledge and 19th century ethnographic descriptions of ritual practice. Researchers noted striking similarities between the archaeological installations and documented practices involving ritual specialists. Wooden objects, fat, fire, and secluded settings. This is where the story must be told with care. Old ethnographic records were often written through colonial eyes, and they can contain misunderstandings, distortions, intrusive language, or information taken from communities under unequal conditions. They're not neutral windows. At the same time, when archaeological evidence, community knowledge, and historical descriptions align in specific ways, a rare possibility opens the chance to identify not merely an old object, but the survival of a cultural practice across an immense span of time. The claim is not that every detail is unchanged beyond question. Scholars still debate how to interpret continuity, how much variation may have occurred, and how best to connect archaeological remains with later descriptions. But the match is strong enough to be astonishing. The phrase 500 generations has been used to describe the time depth suggested here, and it has a strange effect on the imagination. 12,000 years is already difficult to grasp. 500 generations makes it more human. It turns time into grandmothers, grandfathers, aunties, uncles, elders, teachers, learners, and those who came before names could be written in any surviving form. It suggests knowledge moving not through a book, but through people. A person learns from someone trusted. That person later teaches another. The practice continues, perhaps with changes, perhaps with periods of concealment, perhaps with regional shifts, but with enough structure that its form can still be recognized after an almost unbelievable span of time. No single explanation fully accounts for how such transmission endures. It depends on memory, authority, place, protocol, and the deep seriousness of law. The cave setting matters. Clogg's Cave was not simply a convenient shelter for daily living. Evidence suggests that parts of it were used in ways different from ordinary occupation. A cave can separate an action from the everyday world. It can create privacy, danger, power, and focus. Fire inside a cave behaves differently from fire in open country. Smoke gathers, shadows move over stone. A small flame can appear intense because the surrounding dark is so complete. A stick placed near such a fire is not just a stick in the archaeological sense. It is part of an act. The act may involve words, intention, restricted knowledge, and social meaning that archaeology cannot hear. What survives is the material residue after voice, breath, gesture, and meaning have disappeared from the physical record. This is one of the most profound lessons of Clogg's Cave. Archaeology usually finds leftovers. It finds what people dropped, broke, ate, burned, buried, or abandoned. It is much harder to find purpose, especially ritual purpose, because ritual often uses ordinary materials in extraordinary ways. A stone may be just a stone, or it may be placed with meaning. A fire may cook food, or it may mark a transformation. A piece of wood may be fuel, tool, offering, symbol, or something that cannot be translated into outsider categories. At Clogg's Cave, the arrangement of the fireplaces and wooden artifacts, their location, their composition, and their connection to cultural accounts create a rare case where intention becomes more visible than usual. The evidence remains incomplete, because it must be incomplete, but it is unusually eloquent. It also challenges a common mistake about oral cultures. People sometimes assume that without writing, traditions must quickly blur beyond recognition. Clogg's Cave suggests something very different. Under the right conditions, knowledge held in community, place, and law can be extraordinarily durable. Writing is one kind of memory technology, ceremony is another, repetition is another, restricted transmission is another. A cave itself can become part of the system, because returning to the same kind of place in the same country ties action to geography. The practice is not floating in the air, It is anchored. It belongs somewhere. That somewhere helps preserve it. At the same time, Clogg's Cave should not be used to flatten the whole story into one dramatic claim. It does not prove that all First Nations traditions can be traced unchanged for 12,000 years. It does not mean that every cultural form is fixed. It does not make Aboriginal cultures into timeless relics. Its importance is more precise and more powerful. It shows that in at least one place, with community-led interpretation and archaeological evidence working together, a line of cultural transmission may be visible from the end of the last ice age into the recent historical period. That is rare anywhere in the world. It gives substance to the larger idea that continuity can exist through performance, memory, and lore, not only through texts and monuments. There is also a quiet reversal here. For a long time, colonial thinking treated Indigenous knowledge as fragile, unreliable, or secondary to written sources. Clogg's Cave turns that assumption inside out. The written record alone would have seemed strange, partial, and culturally distant. The archaeology alone might have been hard to interpret, but when placed alongside Guinea knowledge and authority, the evidence becomes deeper. The cave does not simply confirm a European note from the 19th century. It reveals the limits of that note and the endurance of the cultural world behind it. The true archive is not only the sediment, it is the relationship between people, place, practice, and memory. In the darkness of Clogg's Cave, the oldest living culture is not an abstract phrase. It becomes a small fire, carefully made, a trimmed stick, placed with purpose, a material so fragile that its survival feels almost impossible. Around it stands an unseen chain of knowledge, not perfect, not simple, not open to every eye, but alive enough to leave its trace in ash and wood. After Murujuga's vast stone landscape, Clogg's Cave offers the opposite kind of evidence: intimate, enclosed, nearly hidden. Yet both speak to the same larger truth. Memory can be carved into rock beneath the sun, and it can also be carried into darkness, where a small flame burns for a moment and somehow reaches 12,000 years. After the cave fires of Clogg's Cave, the story widens again, not into a single shelter or one stone landscape, but across the edge of an entire continent. The Ice Age begins to loosen its grip. Far away, glaciers melt. Water that has been locked in ice returns to the oceans. Slowly at first, then with pulses of greater speed, the seas rise, coastlines move inland, river mouths drown, plains become bays, hills become islands, sand ridges vanish beneath waves. What had once been walking country becomes sea country. This is not a small adjustment on a map. For people living along ancient coasts, it is a transformation of the known world, places where families had camped, gathered shellfish, fished, burned, named, travelled, and told stories are gradually taken by the sea. The land does not disappear all at once, and that may be part of why memory can survive. Change arrives over generations, giving people time to notice, warn, adapt, grieve, and explain. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were much lower than today, Australia was larger. The coastline lay far beyond the modern shore in many regions. The shallow shelves around the continent held plains, wetlands, dunes, rivers, lakes, and pathways now hidden underwater. Sahul linked Australia to New Guinea and, at times, to Tasmania. Then, as the planet warmed after the Ice Age, the sea rose by more than 100 metres. The exact timing varied by region. And scholars still debate the local details of shoreline movement, settlement patterns, and how communities responded in different places. but the broad fact is clear: between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the shape of Australia changed dramatically. The continent people knew became smaller. The sea entered old valleys. The northern land bridge to New Guinea was lost. Bass Strait filled, separating Tasmania from the mainland. The coastlines that had held so much of early life were rewritten by water. For archaeology, this is a disaster and a clue at the same time. It is a disaster because many of the oldest coastal sites may now lie beneath the sea, buried under sediment, broken by waves, or hidden far offshore. If early routes into Sahul followed coasts and islands, then some of the most important evidence for arrival, movement, fishing, shellfish gathering, watercraft, and coastal ceremony may be submerged beyond easy reach. This helps explain why the earliest record can feel so patchy. Absence of evidence along the modern coast does not mean absence of ancient life. The modern coast is not the ancient coast. A person standing on a beach today may be standing far inland relative to where people once gathered food at the edge of the sea. What survives in the record is only the portion that escaped drowning, erosion, burial, and the long decay of organic materials. But rising seas are also a clue because they may have left traces in story. Across parts of the Australian coast, researchers have examined Aboriginal oral traditions that describe seas rising, islands forming, land being lost, or shorelines changing. Some of these traditions appear to correspond with geological events that occurred thousands of years ago, in some cases perhaps more than 7,000 years in the past, and some discussions have suggested even deeper possibilities. The evidence remains incomplete, and caution is necessary. Oral traditions are not simple recordings of events, and they should not be stripped of cultural meaning merely to serve as geological data. Stories may be layered, symbolic, restricted, adapted, or connected to lore in ways outsiders do not fully understand. Still, the possibility that memories of inundation have travelled across such time is extraordinary. It suggests that story can preserve not only moral and spiritual order, but also observations of a changing earth. Imagine what such change might have felt like, not as a global sea level graph, but as lived experience. A freshwater place near the coast begins to taste different. A sandbank that once protected a lagoon is breached more often. Storm waves reach farther inland. A stand of trees dies where salt water now enters. Shellfish beds shift. A path used by grandparents becomes harder to follow. A camp must be moved. A place still named and remembered is now reached only by canoe. They're not reached at all. The people watching this do not think in the language of ice sheets and climate systems. They think in country, kinship, obligation, and story. They know which places are changing because those places already matter. Memory attaches itself to loss because loss has a location. The separation of Tasmania is one of the great examples of this transformation. When sea levels were lower, Tasmania was joined to the mainland by the exposed plains of Bass Strait. As the sea rose, those plains were flooded, and Tasmania became an island. This was not merely a geographic event, it changed the human world. Populations that had once been connected became separated by water. Ecologies shifted, routes ended, regional histories diverged. The later Aboriginal peoples of Tasmania developed under conditions of long isolation, shaped by their own country, climates, resources, and cultural pathways. No single explanation fully accounts for every technological and social change that followed, and older theories often carried colonial assumptions that underestimated Tasmanian Aboriginal knowledge. The more careful view recognises isolation not as a sign of deficiency, but as a powerful force shaping a distinct human history. In the north, the drowning of the land bridge between Australia and New Guinea also changed relationships. What had once been part of a broader Sahul world became divided by the Arafura Sea and Torres Strait. Yet division by water does not always mean total separation. Islands, reefs, and channels can become pathways as well as barriers. In the Torres Strait especially, sea, island, garden, reef, and canoe traditions later formed a rich maritime world. Distinct from mainland Aboriginal cultures but deeply tied to the same larger history of Sahul's transformation, sea country here is not a remnant of land lost to water. It is a living domain of travel, food, identity, and law. A lesser-known part of this story is the emotional discipline required to live with a changing coastline. Modern people often imagine environmental change as an abstract crisis measured in charts. For ancient coastal communities, change would have been absorbed into practice. People adjusted camp locations, altered routes, shifted resource use, maintained stories of places no longer visible, and taught younger generations what the old people had known. The process was not necessarily smooth or painless, but it was not passive. Adaptation meant intelligence. It meant watching, remembering, and reorganizing life around new conditions while carrying old relationships forward. A drowned place could remain country because country is not erased by water. This is why the rising sea belongs near the centre of the mystery. It shows that deep continuity in Australia did not happen because the world stayed stable. It happened despite instability so large that it redrew the continent. The old coastlines vanished, yet memory did not simply vanish with them. The map changed, yet law and story could still hold what the map no longer showed. Archaeology may one day recover more submerged sites and bring lost shores back into view. Until then, the sea itself remains an archive hiding camps, tools, hearths, and perhaps places of ceremony beneath its surface. On calm days it reflects the sky. Beneath it may lie the ground where people once walked, named, watched, and remembered. And above it, in story, song, and living sea country, the drowned world has not fallen completely silent. Beneath the calm surface of sea country, another archive waits. It is not as visible as Murujuga's engraved stones, not as intimate as the small fires of Clog's cave, and not as easy to imagine as a rock shelter with tools in the floor. It lies offshore, under tides, sand, seagrass, coral, silt, and shifting light. For a long time, much of Australian archaeology was forced to work mainly with the land that remained above water, even though everyone knew the ancient map had once been larger. The problem was not imagination, it was access. The old coastal plains were drowned. The shorelines where people may have camped, fished, made tools, gathered shellfish, launched watercraft, held ceremony, and watched the sea move were no longer where modern researchers could walk. They were out beyond the beach, sometimes in shallow water, sometimes far offshore, sometimes buried under layers of marine sediment. The sea had not destroyed the whole story, but it had hidden it. This matters because the first movement into Sahul may have been deeply coastal. People entering the continent from island Southeast Asia likely knew reefs, channels, beaches, mangroves, estuaries, and island chains. The coast would have offered food, routes, visibility, and ways of moving through unfamiliar country. Yet the oldest shorelines are among the least visible parts of the archaeological record. If early people lived heavily along coasts, much of their evidence may now be underwater. This creates a strange imbalance. Inland sites survive and become central to the story, while drowned coastal worlds remain underrepresented, not because they were unimportant, but because sea level rise removed them from ordinary view. The evidence remains incomplete, and the incompleteness is itself a clue. In recent years, underwater archaeology has begun to change this. Off the coast of Murujuga in northwestern Australia, researchers identified ancient submerged Aboriginal archaeological sites on the continental shelf. At Cape Bruguiere, stone artefacts were found in shallow water, and at Flying Foam Passage, evidence was linked with a submerged freshwater spring deeper below the surface. These discoveries are important not only because of their age, but because of what they prove in principle. Ancient Aboriginal cultural landscapes can survive underwater. The seabed is not empty. It can preserve traces of places where people once stood on dry land, made tools, used water sources, and moved through a coastline that has since vanished. No single discovery can recover the full drowned continent, but it changes the question. Instead of asking whether such places exist, researchers can begin asking where else they might be found, how they survived, and how they should be studied in partnership with traditional owners. The phrase submerged archaeology can sound technical, but its emotional meaning is enormous. Imagine diving over a seabed and realizing that the stone beneath the water was once part of someone's walking country. A channel was once a valley. A spring now below the tide may once have been a source of fresh water. A shallow reef may lie near a former plain where people watched animals, gathered plants, or looked toward islands that were easier to reach. Sea country is not merely the ocean after land was lost. It is the continuation of country through transformation. For coastal First Nations peoples, the sea can hold memory, lore, roots, species, and responsibilities. Archaeology is only beginning to catch up with something long understood in cultural terms, that the drowned edge of Australia is still part of the human story. The Great Barrier Reef adds another layer to this hidden coastal world. Today it is often imagined as a natural wonder separate from human deep history, a vast marine system of coral, fish, islands, lagoons, and turquoise water. But for traditional owners, reef and island landscapes are part of sea country, with names, stories, food, travel, ceremony, and authority. The reef as it exists now is relatively young in geological terms, shaped after the last ice age as rising seas flooded the continental shelf and coral systems grew over older landscapes. Beneath and around its islands lie traces of long interaction between people and sea. The reef is not outside history. It is one of the places where history is partly written in tide, shell, sand, coral, and memory. At Jiguru, also known as Lizard Island, off the Queensland coast, a discovery has challenged one of the old assumptions about Aboriginal history. Archaeologists working with traditional owners found pottery fragments dated to roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, making them the oldest securely dated pottery known in Australia. The find matters because for a long time, it was commonly said that Aboriginal Australians did not make pottery before European settlement. That statement now looks too simple. Analysis suggests the pottery was made locally using clays and tempers from Jiguru, though scholars continue to examine its wider connections and meaning. The discovery sits within a broader oceanic world, not far from the Torres Strait, Papua New Guinea, and Pacific traditions where pottery has deep histories. It opens the possibility that Aboriginal communities in this region were part of maritime knowledge networks more complex than older models allowed. The pottery itself should not be made into a sensational exception, as if Aboriginal cultures only become impressive when they resemble technologies valued elsewhere. its importance is subtler. It shows that coastal and island peoples were experimenting, connecting, and choosing. They may have known of pottery through contact networks, may have produced it locally, may have used it for specific purposes, and may not have adopted it everywhere because it did not suit every cultural or environmental context. Technology is not a ladder that all societies climb in the same order. A community can know of a technology and decide it is useful only in certain places. Another can reject it because existing containers, baskets, shells, wooden vessels, bark, skin, or cooking methods work better. The presence of pottery at Jiguru does not mean earlier views were merely missing an object. It means they were missing a more dynamic picture of Aboriginal maritime history. Island networks are especially important here. The sea can isolate, but it can also connect. Islands can serve as stepping stones, meeting places, fishing bases, ceremonial sites, trade nodes, or seasonal destinations, canoe travel, reef knowledge, winds, currents, and star paths can turn water into a road. In northern Australia and the Torres Strait, long histories of contact, exchange, and seafaring complicate any simple image of a continent cut off from the world. This does not erase local independence or distinct identity. It shows that First Nations peoples were active participants in regional worlds, not passive recipients of outside influence. What survives in the record suggests movement of materials, ideas, and relationships across water, although the details vary by region and period. Sea country also reminds us that some of the most important evidence may still be missing. The old shelves around Australia are vast. Many drowned sites may be buried too deeply, eroded away, or difficult to recognise. Others may remain intact but unknown. Each discovery underwater changes the shape of the story on land. A stone artifact on the seabed, a submerged spring, a pottery fragment on an island, a shell midden near an old shoreline. These are not isolated curiosities. They are pieces of a larger coastal history that was partly hidden by the sea. And so, after the rising waters of the last section, the sea becomes something more than a force of loss. It is an archive, a pathway, a memory field, and a living country. It hides ancient camps, but it also preserves relationships. It separates lands, but it connects islands. It covers old routes, but it carries new ones, along reefs, channels, beaches, and drowned plains. First Nations histories continue to challenge the old habit of imagining Aboriginal Australia as inland, static, and isolated. The coast was never just an edge. It was a world in motion, and much of that world is still waiting beneath the water. To survive the changing Australian continent, people did not need to remain the same. They needed to remain related. That distinction is at the heart of the whole story. Across tens of thousands of years, the land did not offer one stable background for culture to rest upon. It shifted again and again. Rains moved, rivers changed, deserts expanded and retreated, forests opened into grassland, wetlands appeared, vanished, and returned in different forms, coastlines drowned. Reef systems grew over older landscapes, animal communities changed, and some species disappeared entirely. Fire altered vegetation, and vegetation altered fire. In such a world, continuity could not mean doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same place forever. Continuity had to mean knowing how to change without losing the deeper relationship between people, country, sea country, law, memory, and obligation. The old stereotype imagines foraging societies as simple wanderers following food wherever it appears. Australia's deep record makes that view impossible to keep. Across the continent, people developed highly specific knowledge systems suited to local environments. In arid and semi-arid regions, survival depended on knowing water in ways that outsiders could barely perceive. A dry creek bed might still hold moisture below sand. A rock hole might need protection from contamination. A claypan might fill after rain and then vanish. Certain plants could signal hidden water or recent seasonal change. Animals left tracks that could be read not only as movement, but as information about weather, direction, and the condition of the land. This was not random wandering. It was practiced attention. It was geography carried in memory, story, route, kinship, and lore. As aridity intensified in some regions, communities adapted through mobility, social connection, and detailed resource knowledge. The central deserts, often imagined as empty, became cultural landscapes of extraordinary precision. People knew when grasses would seed after rain, where edible roots could be found, how to process difficult foods, and how far one could travel between water sources. They knew which places required ceremony, which required permission, which were dangerous, and which could sustain life at particular times. The evidence remains incomplete because many desert technologies used wood, fibre, resin, grass, skin, and other perishable materials. Yet stone tools, grinding surfaces, hearths, plant residues, rock art, and living knowledge all point toward a long history of adaptation that cannot be reduced to mere endurance. Grinding technology is one of the quiet keys to this story. Grinding stones do not look dramatic. They do not shine like gold or rise like temples, but they preserve a revolution of patience. Seeds, tubers, nuts, and other plant foods often require work before they can nourish people. They may need collecting, sorting, pounding, grinding, soaking, leaching, roasting, or cooking. In some places, people developed sophisticated ways of turning small, seasonal, or difficult foods into reliable nourishment. This kind of food system depends on memory of timing, plant behavior, tool maintenance, and shared labor. It also depends on teaching. Someone must learn how fine to grind, how long to soak, which part of a plant to use when a food is ready, and what must never be eaten without preparation. What survives in the record suggests that early Australians were not simply taking food from the landscape. They were transforming landscapes into knowledge and knowledge into survival. Along rivers, another set of adaptations unfolded. River systems could provide fish, shellfish, water birds, plants, reeds, clay, transport routes, and meeting places. In some regions, people built fish traps and managed aquatic resources with engineering skill and ecological care. Stone arrangements, channels, weirs, and traps reveal a relationship with water that is neither accidental nor primitive. These systems required understanding fish movement, seasonal flow, flood behavior, and maintenance over time. They also required social rules. A trap is not only a device, it is part of a community system who can use it when it is opened, how catches are shared, who maintains it, and what obligations surround the place. No single explanation fully accounts for every aquatic system across Australia, because each belongs to its own country and history. But together they challenge the idea that complexity must look like agriculture or cities. On the coasts and reefs, adaptation was equally dynamic. Rising seas changed the position of shorelines, but people continued to live with marine worlds. Shell middens, fish bones, island sites, canoe traditions, reef knowledge, and sea country lore point toward long histories as coastal intelligence. A reef is a difficult place to know well. It changes with tide, moon, season, storm, and water clarity. Fish move through channels. Shellfish must be gathered without exhausting beds. Turtles. Dugongs and other marine life require knowledge of migration, breeding seasons, weather, and respectful harvesting. In some areas, sea travel connected islands and mainland communities, carrying materials, stories, marriage ties, ceremonies, and technologies across water. The discovery of ancient pottery at Jigaru reminds us that coastal peoples were not locked into one timeless toolkit. They made choices, experimented, borrowed, adapted, and rejected according to need and meaning. Fire remained another major instrument of adaptation, though it must be discussed carefully. Aboriginal fire management has often been called fire stick farming, but that phrase can oversimplify a wide range of practices across different countries. Fire used with knowledge can reduce dangerous fuel, encourage fresh growth, attract animals, maintain pathways, protect certain plants, and create mosaics of vegetation at different stages. But fire is not one thing. The timing matters. The wind matters. The season matters. The kind of grass, woodland, scrub, or wetland matters. Burning too hot, too late, too often, or in the wrong place can damage country. Burning well requires inherited ecological knowledge and responsibility. Scholars still debate the deep antiquity, regional differences, and environmental effects of ancient burning. But the broader lesson is clear. People did not merely live in Australian environments. They helped shape them through knowledge, care, and restraint. This pattern of adaptation also appears in technology. Stone tools changed across regions and periods. Wooden weapons, digging sticks, containers, nets, baskets, watercraft, adhesives, ornaments, and fibre technologies almost certainly played major roles, even when they rarely survive from the deep past. In some environments, the most useful technology was not the most archaeologically durable. A net can feed people and vanish. A basket can carry seeds and vanish. A bark canoe can cross water and vanish. A resin adhesive can hold a tool together and vanish. This means that the surviving record may understate the real complexity of ancient life. The absence of preserved objects is not evidence of absence of skill. It is often evidence of decay. Adaptation without disappearance also means cultural adaptation under pressure. Long before colonization, environmental pressure required change. After colonization, the pressures became far more violent and disruptive: dispossession, disease, missions, removals, restrictions, language suppression, and damage to sacred places. This script cannot treat those histories as a brief interruption in an otherwise peaceful, deep-time story. They are part of the living present. Yet even under these pressures, communities continued to hold knowledge, revive language, protect country, teach younger generations, create new art, fight for land rights, and maintain ceremony where possible. Continuity here is not a romantic idea. It is often hard-won. The deeper pattern is transformation with memory. A coastline moves, and sea country remains. A language sleeps, and descendants work to wake it. A plant food becomes less common, and knowledge shifts to other resources. A ceremony is threatened, and people protect what can be protected. A rock art site weathers, and traditional owners continue to care for it. A river changes, and law still speaks through it. This is how a living cultural continuum survives a continent that had never stopped changing, not by refusing time, but by carrying meaning through it. The longer this story continues, the more important it becomes to remember what the evidence cannot hold. Archaeology is powerful, But it is not the past itself. It is the surviving edge of the past, shaped by accident, decay, burial, erosion, water, fire, chemistry, and later disturbance. A stone flake survives because stone is stubborn. A grinding surface survives because repeated hands wore it down. Charcoal survives if the soil protects it. Ochre survives because mineral colour can outlast flesh, voice, bark, fibre, and song. But so much of ancient life was made of things that disappear. A woven bag rots. A wooden bowl collapses into soil. A bark canoe leaves almost no trace. A net, a cord, a feather ornament, a painted body, a gesture, a teaching moment, a melody, a rule spoken quietly to those allowed to hear it. All of these can be central to culture and nearly invisible to excavation. The evidence remains incomplete not because ancient people lacked complexity, but because the world does not preserve complexity evenly. This is one of the great dangers in telling deep history. The things that survive can begin to define the people who made them, because stone tools remain. People are imagined mainly as tool makers. Because rock art remains, they are imagined mainly as artists. Because hearths remain, they are imagined mainly as campers around fire. Because bones and shells remain, they are imagined mainly as eaters of certain foods. But living cultures are not made only of durable objects. They are made of relationships, restrictions, humour, grief, skill, memory, law, kinship, obligation, ceremony, and the 1,000 ordinary gestures by which people recognise one another. The oldest living cultures in Australia cannot be reduced to what sits in a museum drawer or what appears in a trench wall. Those things matter deeply, but they are fragments of a larger human world. Dating deep time adds another difficulty. A date can look clean when printed beside a site name, but behind that number is usually a careful chain of interpretation. Researchers may date sediment grains, charcoal, shell, bone, mineral crusts, or organic residues. Each material answers a slightly different question. A piece of charcoal may tell when a fire burned, but only if it has not moved from another layer. A grain of sand may tell when it last saw sunlight, but only through a method with uncertainties and assumptions. A mineral crust above a painting may show that the image is older than the crust, not exactly when the artist made it. A shell may be affected by marine reservoir effects. A tool may be older than the layer where it is found if disturbed, or younger if it moved downward through cracks or animal burrows. Scholars still debate dates not because they enjoy uncertainty, but because responsible knowledge requires testing how the evidence reached its place. Rock art makes this even more complicated. A wall may be painted, repainted, touched up, covered, renewed, or avoided over long periods. The oldest visible layer may not be the oldest that ever existed. The newest image may sit over older marks whose meanings are still present to traditional owners but difficult for archaeology to separate. In engraved landscapes, weathering may suggest age, but not with the precision of a calendar. A darker patina may indicate greater antiquity. Yet rock chemistry, exposure, slope, and microclimate can confuse the pattern. The desire for a single oldest date is understandable, but sometimes it distracts from the more important fact many of these places were returned to repeatedly. Their significance lies not only in the first mark, but in the long relationship between people, stone, country, and time. Submerged landscapes create another silence. If early coastal routes were important, then some of the oldest evidence may now lie beneath the sea. But underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and dependent on conditions that vary wildly. A site may be covered by sand one season and exposed the next. Artifacts may be scattered by currents. Organic remains may decay unless buried quickly. Some drowned places may be too deep, too disturbed, or too hard to recognize. Others may survive beautifully but remain undiscovered. This means the archaeological map is not a full map of ancient life. It is a map of where evidence has survived and where people have been able to look. No single explanation fully accounts for the gaps, because the gaps have many causes: sea level rise, erosion, funding, access, research history, colonial priorities, and the sheer scale of the continent. Colonization adds another layer of loss and distortion. It damaged people, places, languages, records, and cultural transmission. Sacred sites were destroyed or threatened. Communities were displaced from country. Knowledge was restricted, interrupted, or forced into silence for protection. Objects were taken into collections without consent. Human remains were removed in ways now recognized as deeply wrong. Early writings about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were often shaped by prejudice, misunderstanding, and the colonial need to classify living peoples as if they belonged to the past. Those records may contain useful observations, but they must be read carefully, with awareness of power, context, and harm. The absence of a practice in a colonial document does not mean the practice did not exist. The presence of a description does not mean the writer understood what they saw. This matters because the archive itself is not neutral. Museums, universities, government agencies, and old explorers did not simply collect evidence. They shaped what counted as evidence. For a long time, Western science often privileged material remains over living testimony, written documents over oral tradition, and outsider interpretation over indigenous authority. That balance has been changing, but the legacy remains. Today, the strongest work is often collaborative, guided by traditional owners, shaped by permissions, cultural protocols, and respect for knowledge that may not be public. Archaeology can add dates, materials, patterns, and comparisons. Community knowledge can add authority, meaning, continuity, and limits. Neither should be carelessly folded into the other. The past is not made more accurate by removing living peoples from it. There is also a moral risk in the phrase oldest living culture itself. Used well, it honours extraordinary continuity. Used poorly, it can turn living peoples into symbols, as if their main value is being ancient. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are not important only because they help the world imagine the Ice Age. They are important because they are living cultures with present rights, present creativity, present knowledge, present struggles, and present futures. A rock art site is not only a prehistoric record, it may be a sacred place. A story is not only data about sea level rise, it may be lore. A ceremony is not only evidence of continuity, it may be a responsibility that belongs to specific people. What survives in the record must never be used to take ownership of meaning away from those who carry it. So the mystery at this point becomes more delicate. The question is no longer only what can be proven. It is also how to listen to different kinds of evidence without forcing them into one narrow shape. Stone, pigment, DNA, sediment, oral tradition, language, ceremony, and country each speak differently. Some speak publicly. Some speak only within cultural authority. Some speak in dates. Some in place names. Some in silence. The most honest history does not pretend to hear everything. It accepts that some knowledge is not missing, it is protected. Some gaps are not failures, they are boundaries. Some mysteries remain because time has erased the evidence, and others remain because not everything is meant to be translated for outsiders. And yet, even with all these limits, the story is not empty. It is richer because of them. The gaps remind us that ancient people were more than what survived. The uncertainties remind us that deep time must be approached with humility. The damage of colonization reminds us that continuity is not a simple romance, but a profound act of survival. The living authority of First Nations peoples reminds us that the past is not merely something to be studied. It is something still connected to responsibility. Archaeology can open the ground, but it cannot hold the whole living world that once moved across it. For that, the story must return to country, to sea country, to language, to law, to the people who continue to carry memory forward. The mystery still alive is not found only in ancient layers of earth, not only in stone tools beneath a shelter floor, not only in ochre on rock, not only in a fire pit hidden in a cave, not only in drowned coastlines under a quiet sea. It is found in the present tense. It is found in communities speaking for country, in elders teaching language, in young people learning songs and dances, in rangers caring for land and sea, in artists renewing old designs through new media, in legal battles to protect sacred places, in ceremonies that continue because they are responsibilities, not performances for a vanished world. The oldest living cultures are not living because they have avoided the modern world. They are living because they continue to carry ancient relationships into it, under conditions no Ice Age ancestor could have imagined. This is why the story cannot end with archaeology alone. Archaeology can say that people were at Madjedbebe by deep time. It can examine ochre, axes, grinding stones, hearths, charcoal, submerged artifacts, petroglyphs, and cave deposits. It can show that people adapted to a continent of monsoons, deserts, reefs, rivers, mountains, and changing seas. It can reveal that the old assumption of a simple, static Aboriginal past was never adequate. But archaeology cannot by itself explain what country means to those who belong to it. It cannot fully measure the force of a song carried properly, a place name restored, a language awakened, a ceremony continued, or a child learning safely from family and community that land and sea are not just resources but relations. What survives in the record suggests continuity, but living people show what continuity feels like when it becomes responsibility. In modern Australia, that continuity exists alongside damage. There is no honest way to speak of the world's oldest living cultures without also acknowledging colonization, dispossession, massacres, disease, missions, removals, stolen lands, suppressed languages, restricted movement, and the long effort to make First Nations peoples appear as if they belonged only to the past. These histories are not ancient abstractions. They reach into families, health, land rights, education, memory, and law today. Yet the presence of such damage makes cultural survival more powerful, not less. The story is not one of unbroken ease. It is one of endurance through pressure, renewal after interruption, and refusal to disappear. Language revival is one of the clearest signs of this living thread. Across the continent, communities are recording elders, teaching younger speakers, rebuilding grammars from archives, returning place names, creating language programs, writing songs, making apps, publishing resources, and bringing words back into daily life. Some languages remain strong, some are endangered, some are being reclaimed after generations of forced silence. A revived word is not just a sound. It can carry a plant name, a kinship relation, a direction, A story, a way of addressing country. When language returns, it brings back relationships that English alone cannot hold. Care for country and sea country also brings deep time into the present. Indigenous ranger programs, cultural burning, threatened species work, reef care, site protection, water management, and community-led conservation are not simply modern environmental jobs. In many places, they continue older obligations through new tools, satellite mapping, legal agreements, scientific partnerships, drones, boats, databases, and university collaborations. This is not a contradiction. Ancient responsibility can use modern equipment. A person can hold a phone and still belong to country. A community can work with scientists without surrendering cultural authority. Continuity does not require refusing change. It requires deciding what change serves. Art carries the same force. Contemporary First Nations artists paint on canvas, carve, film, weave, perform, compose, photograph, and create digital works that speak from old countries into global spaces. Some works draw on ancestral designs and stories. Some confront colonization directly. Some are political, some ceremonial, some personal, some public, some restricted in meaning. Their power lies partly in refusing the old division between ancient and modern. A painting made today can belong to a tradition far older than any empire, while also speaking directly to the present. It can be contemporary without being disconnected, ancient without being frozen. The phrase 50,000-year mystery therefore needs a final turn. The mystery is not whether people remained unchanged for 50,000 years. They did not, because no human beings do. The mystery is how change itself was held inside continuity. How did many peoples maintain relationships with country while seas rose and old plains drowned? How did law travel through story, dance, ceremony, and language? How did memory survive without writing, not as a weaker substitute for writing, but as a disciplined and living system of its own? How did communities endure colonization and still carry forward knowledge that links them to deep time? No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the answer is not one invention or one institution. It is the combined strength of place, kinship, law, memory, adaptability, and care. This is why the story remains unlike the usual ancient mystery. There is no lost city to uncover and declare finished. No final tablet waits beneath the sand with the complete answer. No single excavation will solve what these cultures are. The mystery continues because it is alive, and living things do not become complete evidence for outsiders. They speak, change, protect, refuse, welcome, teach, and renew on their own terms. First Nations cultures of Australia are among the deepest continuities in human history, but they are not behind the modern world. They stand inside it, carrying older relationships than the modern world knows how to measure. So the last image of the story is not a ruin. It is not an abandoned temple or a silent cave. It is a person standing on country at dawn, with the sea or desert or river or stone country before them, not as scenery but as relation. Behind that moment lie Ice Age crossings, ancient tools, rock walls, rising seas, hidden coasts, fires in caves, songs, languages, ceremonies, losses, survivals, and returns. Ahead lies a future still being fought for and cared for. The oldest living culture is not a relic from before history. It is history still breathing. The further back the story reaches, the quieter it becomes. The noise of empires fades first. Kings lose their names. Armies dissolve into dust. Cities that once believed they were the centre of the world become layers under grass, sand, water, and stone. But somewhere beyond all of that, before the first walls of Mesopotamia, before the stones of Britain were raised, before the pyramids caught the desert sun, people were watching the Australian sky and learning the moods of country. They were finding water, shaping tools, grinding seeds, carrying ochre, crossing sea paths, painting stone, lighting careful fires, and teaching memory in forms that could travel farther than any written page. What remains from them is never enough, and somehow it is more than enough. A flake of stone does not tell a whole life. A petroglyph does not explain every meaning it once held. A drowned coast does not easily give back the footsteps it covered. A cave fire cannot restore the voices that surrounded it. But together, these traces point towards something vast, a human continuity made not from stillness, but from relationship. The land changed. The sea rose. Species vanished. Languages shifted. Colonization broke and wounded, yet the thread did not end. There is comfort in that, but not a simple comfort. Survival is not gentle just because it is beautiful. Memory can be heavy. Responsibility can be demanding. Country asks to be cared for, not admired from a distance. Sea country holds old places beneath moving water. Rock walls keep images whose meanings are not always ours to know. Some stories are shared, some are protected. Some silences are not emptiness, but lore. And so the mystery remains alive in the only way a living mystery can. It does not sit still for history. It moves through people. It is sung, danced, spoken, painted, revived, defended, and carried forward. It belongs to many First Nations peoples, many countries, many sea countries, many languages, and many futures. Deep time is often imagined as something lost behind us, but here it feels closer, like a low fire still glowing under ash, like a star reflected in dark water, like a name spoken for a place that has never stopped listening. In the end, the oldest story is not a story of disappearance. It is a story of presence. The continent changes under the sky. The tide moves over drowned ground. The red stone warms in the morning light, and memory keeps walking.